Hey everyone, welcome to a Legal Live. I think the last time we had a live event was our convention, and that was great. We appreciate everyone's questions. We've gotten really good feedback from that, um, so we're excited to kind of jump back into it again. We have Lance Harrison, legal counsel for the Utah Association of Realtors, and I'm also legal counsel as well, Craig Wagner. The hotline has been very busy over the last couple of weeks, and Lance and I have noticed at least some repeat questions, and I think we want to address those and maybe go through a form that we commonly get asked about. So what we're going to talk about today are repairs and maybe due diligence items, and maybe the ways to handle those and negotiate those. Certainly, we recognize that we're in a seller's market, so certainly most sellers have quite a bit of leverage in negotiating that. But we think that certainly the concepts and the principles we're going to talk about are going to be relevant in all markets as you represent your buyers and certainly as you represent your sellers. So I'm going to go ahead and share the UAR's resolution of due diligence addendum. So before we even go through the points on this form, Lance, maybe could you give us just a brief overview of maybe what due diligence is for and why, how can maybe just what due diligence is for and how a buyer can best address any sort of due diligence items.
Yeah, for sure. So, of course, due diligence is the first kind of major contingency in the contract, right? So, it's the time that the parties have agreed that the buyer has some time to get to know the property and to do any kind of tests or other kind of inspections that they would like to do in deciding whether they want to move forward with the contract. So inspections and just looking at things that maybe they didn't see on their initial look through, or more in-depth things, hiring specialists to come in and look at different issues, whether that's anything you want to do during due diligence, right? That is what due diligence is for. And so that's when some issues potentially could come up that you weren't aware of. So you might want to renegotiate the contract or decide to back out.
Yeah. It's a condition of purchase. Buyer is really digging into the evaluation of the property as to those things that are important to the buyer. And certainly the condition of the property is going to be one of the top priorities for the buyer. So looking at this resolution of due diligence addendum, this form replaced the old repairs addendum. And there's a couple of reasons for that. You'll notice that the title alone, resolution of due diligence, it is meant to resolve due diligence items, and they don't always have to be repairs. That is the resolution. And so you'll kind of notice that we're encouraging buyers to maybe utilize possible avenues outside of repairs, simply because there could be some underwriting issues and lender issues that are associated with repairs, and we'll get into that a little bit. But looking at this form, ideally what would happen is that this form would be negotiated before it's even presented as a modification to the contract. Well, we're hoping that the buyer and seller, through their realtors, are having some communication about these items, so that the resolution of due diligence addendum is sent over and hopefully accepted as it's presented. So hopefully there's negotiation, and that could be verbal, text message, email. Hopefully there's some understanding and resolved as part of this form, or frankly, another form like a blank addendum. But you'll notice that this is a way to help educate your buyer about some of the options in resolving some due diligence items. So if you look at section 1, closing costs, Lance, maybe you could go through section 1 and kind of explain why we started with closing costs.
Yeah, for sure. So just like Craig said, these are all just kind of options to think about in your negotiations, right? So we don't jump straight to repairs because there might be some other options that are going to make the transaction maybe a little bit smoother. And so to explain these to your clients, say, here are the pros and cons of going with these different options. So closing costs, I think that we put this first here because it's a really great option to think about that puts money back in your client's pocket instead of doing repairs and avoiding some of those repair issues. That still gives them the option to get the money and do those repairs later if they want on their own and avoid those issues. So what does it say? It says seller shall contribute a settlement and amount blank, some kind of amount that you can negotiate toward a large kind of laundry list of different things that they're going to have to pay out of pocket at settlement. And so that can be all sorts of things. So a permanent reduction in the loan or interest rate, mortgage financing costs, closing costs, prepaids and escrows. And if there's extra left over, it can be used to reduce the purchase price. So maybe you're going to hit up some of your limits on what you're allowed to get covered. Maybe the lender will tell you what you can and can't do or how much you can use, but your purchase price can ultimately be reduced in that. So that's kind of the first best option, I think, in thinking outside the box.
Yeah, and the nice thing about this section is that if you've already negotiated some closing costs as part of your original offer, this amount is going to be in addition to that amount. And so it's if you had agreed to $1,000 up front as part of the original offer, and now you agree to an additional $2,000, it's going to be a total of $3,000 of closing costs. And I agree, it is something that hopefully is palatable to a buyer and potentially a seller in making the deal work. So, and then section 2, purchase price reduction. It's pretty self-explanatory. It obviously doesn't get the items repaired, but it does reduce the overall purchase price. And I've had people say, look, Craig, even if you reduce the purchase price by 10 grand or whatever it may be, that may reduce my buyer's mortgage payments by a couple of dollars, and they need to get this substantial repair done. That's not really going to give them the funds to complete the repair. And I recognize that. We're just going through these first two options as maybe those situations that a repair isn't necessary, and certainly the transaction could be successful without the seller doing certain repairs. If you're going to utilize section 1 and 2 and that's it, frankly, you wouldn't necessarily even have to use this form. You could just use a blank addendum with additional closing costs, or you could use a blank addendum modifying the purchase price. And what I would not write in those, if you did go that route, I would not say in lieu of repairs and then do a purchase price reduction, because that's going to raise some red flags as to what were the repairs that are now in lieu of. So I would just go through. You certainly could use this form. I'm just saying you don't have to. Now, where we get some, I don't know, controversy, or at least some conflict as to what you should and shouldn't do, we'll go to section 3. And we do have a Facebook question, and I think it's a relevant question, and I think it's a great question. The idea of negotiating repairs outside of the REPC, maybe through a repairs letter or memo, or however you want to describe it, and the legalities surrounding that. So there's a reason why this resolution of due diligence addendum addresses repairs in the REPC. Lance, maybe you could explain the idea of negotiating repairs outside of the REPC, and then maybe the potential consequences for doing so.
Yeah, for sure. This comes up occasionally, right? Where they say, it would just be so much easier if we can agree to repairs outside the REPC and not tell the lender about it. That would solve a lot of problems, right? And I say, yeah, it would solve a lot of problems, but that right there is the red flag, right? That the lender wants to know about these because they could affect the loan. So of course, that's why we need to tell them about it. And there's several different things that come into play here. First of all, the REPC itself says this is the entire agreement. You're agreeing and certifying that, yes, all the terms of our of our entire transaction are part of the REPC. So if you have an outside agreement, then potentially you're violating the REPC and you're hiding something from the lender that they might want to know. And there's also a division rule that says, if there's an outside agreement that could affect the loan and you don't disclose it to the lender, that could be a potential violation. So yes, they should be in the REPC, but when it comes to negotiating is different than agreeing on something, right? So I think you can negotiate, you can talk about, you can offer, but if you come to an agreement, then it needs to end up in the REPC and not outside the REPC. That's kind of how I approach repairs to be safe, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you could start with a laundry list of 10 items and negotiate outside of the REPC, and certainly that would be fine. But once you come to a resolution, that needs to be put into the REPC itself. Yeah, because it's material. And like Lance mentioned, it is creating a double contract if you don't put it in the REPC. And that certainly has licensing implications. So don't do that. Negotiate however you want. Resolution goes into the REPC. Now, section 3 is addressing repairs. And again, I would utilize this section as kind of the last resort based on what your buyer wants and frankly needs. So this is where the buyer is saying, look, I really want the seller to do these repairs. And hopefully buyer and seller have agreed to have the repairs done, and then they incorporate it into this addendum. Again, I see this resolution of due diligence addendum being used when both the buyer and seller have already kind of negotiated the points of what the form is going to look like, the language of the form. So there is some language in here that we've had questions about, and I can certainly give you the insight between the forms committee as to why we have the language we do. Certainly we're open to modifying this language in the future. But you'll notice that section 3, specifically right here, you have seller agrees that the seller and buyer agree that the seller will be responsible for completion of the repairs by the settlement deadline. So you have a finite window of when the repairs need to be done, unless otherwise agreed to in writing. Sellers shall, through contractors, complete the repairs to comply with applicable law, including governmental permit, inspection, and approval requirements. We've had some feedback that's saying, look, why can't the seller just do it? Now there's good and bad with that. We've had instances where the seller does the repairs and the workmanship and the quality really aren't up to the standard that the buyer would want. And so certainly buyer and seller could agree to have the seller do the repairs, but we wanted to have someone that had the ability to do so as the default answer. And you notice it says through contractors. Not all contractors have to be licensed. Certainly there could be repairs that don't require someone to be licensed by, have a professional licensure. But in those instances when they do, like maybe a roof repair or something like that, that is the default. They will be through a contractor and comply with applicable law. Now we tried to address the quality of the repair. And you'll notice that last sentence, all repairs shall be performed in a workmanlike manner with materials of quality and appearance comparable to existing materials. Again, we're trying to get into the quality of the repair, but just know when you're advising buyer and seller that there is always going to be an element of subjectivity. What the buyer is expecting could be different than what the seller is expecting to have done. And that's just one of the risks associated with repairs. I had a call, probably a couple of months ago, dealing with a radon mitigation system. It was clear buyer and seller agreed that seller would install a radon mitigation system in the basement. Seller did, but when the buyer came to observe the work that was done, it was put in a location that the buyer would not have agreed to, or frankly didn't want. But it was put in the basement. That's what the buyer agreed to. That's what the seller agreed to. Seller chose the spot that was cheapest. Buyer would have preferred a spot that was maybe not so prevalent in the basement. And so something like that, again, a level of subjectivity. So you have to be very specific on the detailing. And so you'll notice in the blanks, and this is where the realtor's value comes in, is really describing the repair, and I would get as detailed as possible so that there's not any sort of ambiguity. But I would just advise your buyer and seller that there is going to be that level of subjectivity, that there could be disagreements down the road. So that's kind of the repairs. 3.1. So Lance, we never like to talk about this. Sellers agreed they're going to do the repairs by the settlement deadline. But what happens if the seller doesn't complete the repairs? And it's not always because the seller doesn't want to. There could be inclement weather or something that could prevent the seller from having the repair completed. But under 3.1, maybe you can go through that first paragraph as to the remedies for a buyer if the seller hasn't completed the repairs.
Yeah, for sure. So of course, this is always a risk, right? And so it's really important to address this type of thing, to look out for potentialities, right, in the contract. And hopefully this doesn't happen, but if it does, it's good that they've agreed on some way forward, right? So the buyer remedies for unfinished repairs, this first paragraph gives kind of a general remedy, and then you have a few options if you want to go beyond that. And this first kind of remedy is to do an escrow agreement with the seller, to escrow some money to cover that. And that needs to be approved by the lender. And sometimes that may or may not work, right? So there is some risk there, and it's all kind of last minute at this point if you're here. So it's just important to know that there is some risk here. And if you have the choice to do A or B, but if you don't choose one of those, then that escrow is the only remedy, and it may or may not work out. So just a little thing to notice and to take account of when negotiating this. And then we get down to A or B, and you have a few other options. So in option A, they can cancel the REPC and get their earnest money. That's a good option to give them another out, to say at last minute, no, we're not going to go forward. You are not agreeing to you're not doing what we've agreed to do. And that is a predetermined amount to say, yeah, there might be other damages, but we're going to stick to the earnest money, which is what we mean by liquidated damages there. And the seller agrees to pay that upon demand. And then third is not cancel, but to go forward, right? Option B, buyer may complete the purchase and then pursue other remedies available. And that usually means going after damages, right? You've damaged me in some way. I'm going to force you to pay whatever you damaged me, or to do something else to complete the repair or something. And that does survive closing. So hopefully we're thinking about other options, but if it comes down to it, these are some of the options for unfinished repairs.
Yeah, and this is maybe getting into the weeds a little bit, but under the previous version of the REPC, so pre-2018, there was a section 11 that had a predetermined remedy in case the seller didn't complete the repairs. And the remedy was that buyer and seller would escrow a reasonable amount as approved by the lender, if applicable. That remedy was great, but in some instances it didn't work. I mean, depending on the repair, the lender may say, look, no, we need the repair completed before we're going to finance on the transaction. This is our security interest. And so that created a potential default scenario for the buyer if the repair wasn't completed by settlement. And so now we have these check boxes, and here's how I like to think of it. Certainly it's not mandatory in how I'm explaining it, but I like to think 3.1A would be for those really big repairs. So it gives the buyer the right to cancel, they get their earnest money back, they get a sum equal to the earnest money. So if the buyer puts $5,000 of earnest money back down and the seller doesn't complete the repair, then the seller's going to pay buyer $5,000. And so that could be for those big repairs where the buyer's saying, look, I may not even get my financing if the roof isn't repaired, or the sewer system isn't completely clean, whatever it may be, the really big items that could potentially make the property uninhabitable, or the lender may require those things to be completed. 3.1B, I see for those more minor repairs. And again, this is where buyer and seller are negotiating repairs, and then they come to an agreement with this resolution. For those more minor repairs, where the buyer's saying, look, I'm not going to cancel if these repairs aren't completed, but I do want to preserve the right to have seller compensate me after the fact, 3.1b would be appropriate. And that's where you kind of weigh whether or not something's important or something would warrant canceling the contract. And I think really your buyer would be in the best position to answer that question. And so certainly in advising a seller, 3.1a has some serious ramifications. 3.1b also has some serious ramifications. So just making clear to both buyer and seller these options. And these options shouldn't look unfamiliar. I mean, they're mirrored after the default section in section 16.2 of the REPC. So these aren't new remedies, but it is requiring buyer and seller to agree on an additional remedy upfront. Okay, now moving on to section 4, and if you guys have any questions, those that are viewing, feel free to write them in. We'll try to address them. But section 4, we've been getting quite a few questions, Lance, about this section. I think I had 2 or 3 just yesterday, and the previous week I had 2 or 3. So it means that people are using this form. That's good. Maybe we need to look at section 4 language to make it even more clear, but maybe you could go through section 4 and kind of explain to us what is meant by this section and what is the impact, especially for A, in dealing with this section.
Yeah, and this can have some big impacts. So it's really important to understand and go through it kind of slowly to make sure we all are on the same page, especially with the other party, with the other realtor, and make sure that we understand the same things, because sometimes they can be on different pages. And so then you get into a conflict somehow. But so let's read through this. Upon acceptance of the addendum, buyer's objections to due diligence shall be deemed resolved, and due diligence is waived by buyer unless checked below. So if you do nothing, you don't check anything, due diligence is waived. That just means your due diligence period is over, right? No matter what the date is on your due diligence, you've waived the right to do more due diligence once you've agreed to this. Now, that hopefully is the normal thing you would do, because you don't want to leave it open to further negotiations once you've reached a resolution, right? You want to be done with negotiations and be able to move on in the contract and not worry about a cancellation or additional repairs coming up later or things like that. Now, if you would like to leave that window open, or there's a reason to, that's what the checkbox is for, is say, we're not going to waive it. We're going to agree to something here, but maybe the due diligence condition isn't over for another week. We're going to mark this so we have additional week because we need to do some additional tests or something. That leaves the door open to still do some tests, to cancel if necessary, or renegotiate. That's why it's probably not best to mark that unless there's a reason to, so you can move on. But that's kind of the basic understanding for that section.
Yeah, again, if we kind of work off the premise that buyer and seller through their realtors are already negotiating the terms of this addendum to resolve due diligence, I can't think of many scenarios where 4A would be checked. Now, the question that I've been getting is, well, let's say 4A is checked and seller does accept this addendum. Does that mean that buyer's due diligence is now extended up until settlement? Is that somehow preserving due diligence for an indefinite period of time? And my answer to that would be no. It just means you're preserving the due diligence condition up until the due diligence deadline. So if the deadline is tomorrow, great, then you're preserving it for a day. That's all you're doing. Waiving, I see a question, waiving is confusing. The reason we used waived due diligence is because that mirrors the language in the REPC. If you look at section 8.1, it talks about buyer and seller resolving buyer's objections. So we tried to mirror the same language that was already used in section 8.1. So that's kind of the rationale, just trying to keep it consistent with the REPC section 8.1. So again, I would think that most sellers, if they're agreeing to a price reduction or closing costs or doing repairs, they don't want the buyer to come back and ask for more when they've already accepted this addendum, in theory, resolving buyer's due diligence items. There shouldn't be anything else the buyer should need to ask for at that point. Doesn't mean that the two parties can't renegotiate or talk through certain things after that, but really the due diligence item should be resolved. So that's kind of how I see it. I think that's a pretty good overview on that, Lance. Certainly, if you have any suggestions or questions about this form or any UAR form, we're always looking to make them better, more user friendly for our members. We are looking for ways to provide value so that you can provide value to your clients. So we definitely want you to have that. Are there any other things that you can think of, Lance, in addressing repairs or due diligence that maybe we should address that we haven't?
No, I just think, that discussion we had after, section 3, it just highlights why repairs can get a little hairy, right? When we're trying to get them done. And so why there's hopefully some other options that we should look at, like we discussed.
I think I have another one. What if the loan officer is telling you, take those repairs out of the REPC? I mean, how do you handle it then? I mean, we talked about double contracts and things like this should be in the REPC. What if the loan officer is telling you? How would you advise realtors in representing their clients with those types of instructions?
Yeah, I would say you might have to push back a little bit and say, well, maybe you can put that instruction in writing for me or something like that, because it just, some loan officers are going to do the easy route potentially and say, yeah, it might cause some problems. Just agree to that outside or something. But the underwriter is going to want to know about these things. So that's what I would say is, hey, if the lender puts it in writing that it can be in an outside agreement, great. Let's do that. But without that, I'd be very hesitant to do that. I think you can have some very negative outcomes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I like your suggestion of, well, okay, loan officer, put that in writing that you're specifically asking us to come to an agreement outside of the REPC. And I would venture to guess that the loan officer won't do that for obvious reasons, for the reasons that Lance outlined about it being material. So yeah, very good advice there. There was a suggestion that we need a contingency removal form to help both sides know we are moving on or not. I think we have something similar, but maybe we could address an addendum just for that. We do have the option to keep property on market time clause addendum, and that does remove conditions. And there's a notice form that indicates buyer is removing certain conditions. But if buyer and seller simply just want to remove a due diligence condition, I mean, I would just use a blank addendum saying buyer and seller mutually agree they're removing the due diligence condition. I can't think of many instances where a buyer would agree to that unless they're getting some sort of concessions. And that's where, like this, where the default in section 4 of the resolution of due diligence addendum makes it clear buyer is no longer has a due diligence condition. They've waived it as per 8.1. So excellent suggestions. Appreciate everyone's feedback on this and tuning in. It's great. Lance and I have been going out and teaching and seeing people. We really enjoyed that. We enjoy connecting with you on Facebook. The convention was great. We enjoyed having so many different realtors tune into that. We hope it was beneficial, and we love doing it. So again, the legal hotline is open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8:30 to 4. All you have to do is just leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. You do have the option to leave a message on days outside of the hotline period. Just know that it'll carry on to the following day when the hotline is open. We'll try to continue to address things that we see on the hotline and hear about. And please let us know if you have any suggestions for future topics on our Facebook page. We'd love to address those things as well. Well, Lance, thanks for your participation. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Until next time, talk to you later. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.